rights, and they can be linked in many ways. Yet the relationship is less straightforward and does require some critical evaluation. There is some reference to human rights in the Declaration, and many of the targets attached to the Sustainable Development Goals do refer to human rights, but use a very implicit language. Nowhere in the goals themselves is there any explicit reference to human rights. Rather, there's a reliance on terms such as participation, dignity, those kind of words. And of course, these terms have a lot to be said for themselves, but unless they're rooted in identified standards, their meaning is rather conveniently open-ended and subjective. You might even argue, but in light of time we can't really get into that, but there's something deeply troubling actually about mixing language of goals with language of rights, whereas goals is something we work towards achieving, and the human rights discourse, in essence, is much more bringing an immediate end to abuse and violations. So there's something, at least morally, very disturbing in mixing that. But now I'm sort of doing what I said I wouldn't do. So the discourse of sustainable development goals is out there, and it's a powerful discourse. And the human rights community, different from back in the Millennium Development Goals days, has started to engage much more actively. Philip Alston, when he analyzed the engagement of the human rights community with the MDGs, he looked at all the work of the treaty bodies, and he found hardly any meaningful reference to the MDGs. I just looked at the work of the treaty bodies supervising the major human rights treaties in 2 years, and I found hundreds of references to the SDGs. So there seems to be a much more a recognition that the SDGs are important to human rights, and they've started to engage with them. So, the main issue, this recognition of the private sector as a key partner, a crucial partner in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This is firstly necessary to mobilize all available resources. It's going to take an enormous, mind-boggling amount of money to achieve the SDGs, and this is where the private sector first and foremost comes in, to raise the financial resources needed. But the role carved out for the private sector in the SDGs, in Agenda 2030, goes way beyond that. It's about creating jobs, tax income, technological innovation, and it's a very rosy picture that is painted, a win-win rhetoric around the SDGs, which ignores basically the clear tension that is likely to arise where the private sector is put forward as the answer to many of the sustainable development problems out there, especially if there's no recognition of the possibility of the sector actually being complicit in creating these problems. So it's precisely because companies have this role where they, in addition to creating jobs and bringing innovation, can also bring damage to people and the environment. It's crucial that the private sector takes up this role, if they do, in a responsible manner. So that brings me to the business and human rights discourse. It's especially over these last decades that we have started to witness a paradigm shift in talking and thinking about the responsibilities of corporations when it comes to human rights violations. With the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights by the Human Rights Council in 2011, this has proven a very important catalyst in this thinking. The Guiding Principles, which no doubt you will have heard of, which outline the obligations of states when it comes to human rights and the responsibilities of corporations, and the right to an effective remedy for victims of human rights abuse, they have found wide endorsement. Concepts in these guiding principles, such as human rights due diligence, for example, have found their way into many international standards, regulation, policy documents, into national legislation. And together, this whole body of rules and regulations, legislation out there, they form a body of prescriptive ideas which structure thinking about corporations and human rights. And if we read the work of the architect of the UN Guiding Principles, Professor John Ruggie, the special representative to the Secretary General, who led this whole project, which ended in the UN Guiding Principles. If you read his scholarly work, he's not a lawyer, he has an international relations background. This process of this uptake of the UN Guiding Principles through dissemination, through distributed networks, is exactly what he set out to achieve. The idea behind the Guiding Principles is that they would act as a global script, which elements of which would stimulate uptake through processes of persuasion and socialization. So once this script is widely accepted by relevant parties and diffuses globally, a new set of constitutive rules can emerge that define and pre-structure socially accepted corporate conduct. So such constitutive rules can emerge once these norms have gone through these stages of persuasion, socialization, and ultimately internalization. And they then take on this taken for granted quality. Well, this is a typical social constructivist approach, and it rests on the assumption that compliance, in the end, results primarily from this internalization of norms, in this case, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, rather than through coercion or through persuasion through law. Such a process is intimately linked with language. So rhetoric on business and human rights can be seen as an important indicator of the extent to which norms in this field of business and human rights are actually being internalized. So it can be argued that the express use of business and human rights language frames policy responses by implicitly guiding actors towards a universalistic impetus in the domain of business and human rights. So the extent to which specific terms and concepts are explicitly used is telling for the degree to which commitments are actually being internalized by these actors. And if we find that there is a preference for alternative terms, participation, for example, in the SDGs, it can be seen as perhaps a convenient way of actually avoiding terms that have a much more fixed normative meaning. So, for the UN Guiding Principles, what John Ruggie set out with this project to achieve, for them to become a normative success, it's crucial that they're replicated, standardized, and ultimately internalized by relevant actors. And there is some evidence of this process taking place. So I've put some abbreviations on the slide of international organizations that have started to adopt this business and human rights discourse. So these UN Guiding Principles are being disseminated through these networks by uptake by the OECD, the International Finance Corporation, at all kinds of different levels. For example, there are around the world currently 20 states that have adopted a national action plan on business and human rights, which is about how these UN Guiding Principles are going to be implemented. And there are 10 countries currently developing such a national action plan. There are many, many examples of what Finmore and Sicking have called norm cascading. That's why I put this nice picture of this waterfall on the slide. So the idea that norms cascade by these processes beyond their institutional sphere of origin. So that brings me to the question that I address in my paper: to what degree this norm cascading of this discourse on business and human rights can be witnessed in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Here again I have to just make one comment. The emphasis on this mimicry of global standards, which is a core concept of this social constructivist approach, can be criticized. and perhaps should be criticized, because it runs the risks of decontextualization from local communities and pays insufficient attention to bottom-up shaping of global standards.
Nicola?
Yes.
In view of the time, can I ask you to wrap up in 2 minutes?
Yes, I will. Because actually, the concepts in the UN Guiding Principles, such as transparency, is something that Rachel is going to address. I read your fascinating paper, so I will just quickly then move on to some of the findings, how I went about it on my findings. So that's 2 minutes. So how is the business and human rights discourse shaping the Sustainable Development Goals? Has this language of business and human rights found its way into the SDGs? I did a search for concepts and terms that are key elements of the UN Guiding Principles and key elements of this business and human rights discourse that has started to develop. I looked at the core documents, so the 2030 Agenda and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and I found very little explicit reference to this language. In fact, only paragraph 67 of Agenda 2030 explicitly refers to the UN Guiding Principles, and beyond that, there's a preference for this use of this much vaguer language, sustainable corporate practices, things like that. So it fails to make explicit in these core documents whether there is any common understanding of what this terminology actually means. But the proof of the pudding, of course, is in the eating. So states have started to report on how they are implementing, how are they trying to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So I took a sample of 44 voluntary national reports of the first 2 rounds of voluntary national reporting, and also conducted this search for these different terms coming from this business and human rights discourse to find out whether states are actually using the terminology. So some of the findings, well, you can see it, I won't go into it in detail, it's going to be in my paper, but what it boils down to is that there is some use of the language, perhaps surprising given that there is so little reference in the core documents, but some states do use the terminology and these concepts when reporting on the SDGs, but it's very limited, and it's only limited to a couple of mostly Western European states. So the degree of internalization of the business and human rights discourse in the context of the SDGs is very limited. So the 2 ships seem to be passing in the night with very little interaction. So does it matter? That's the last question I quickly want to ask. Does it matter that the business and human rights agenda seems to be unable to make a significant impact in the context of the SDGs, which explicitly calls upon corporations to take up a critical role in achieving these goals? If discourse indeed subtly guides actors, then the wording of Agenda 2030 could actually further encourage a very superficial approach by business in future agreement and policies. And we've seen how the business and human rights discourse has been evolving. It's actually been an attempt to move away from this completely voluntary approach, which has been the core of corporate sustainable, of CSR. So even though we've had this evolution and development of the business and human rights discourse, in the context of the SDGs, that seems to still continue this completely, strictly voluntary approach. So the lack of explicit use of the business and human rights discourse casts serious doubts on this normative success of the UN Guiding Principles and the business and human rights discourse, at least in that context. And I would argue that as the SDGs offer a powerful discourse, they rival and ultimately undermine what the business and human rights discourse sets out to achieve. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for giving us a perspective on the potential of soft law approaches, RUGI and the SDGs, and of the pros and cons of framing cases and/or issues as business and human rights. So we've been sort of on the high ground of courtrooms and of the United Nations and the diplomats negotiating the SDGs. I expect that we now will get a more local perspective through the presentation of Peter Knorringa of ISS and Samar Abdelnour of Rotterdam School of Management of Erasmus University, who will speak to the challenge of local embedding of global standardization for sustainability. Peter, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karin. Good morning. Indeed, Samer and I are not lawyers, so we're not talking about the distinction between private law or human rights law or any of these sort of internal divisions. We are from another planet. We look at local impacts of these often well-intentioned attempts at developing global standards, whether by governments or by corporations or by NGOs. And we often find that at the local level, this distinction between voluntary standards and regulatory standards is not so important. Actually, many of these sort of corporate and NGO-related standards are voluntary only in the sense that there's no state involved. But they're not voluntary for the companies that are actually supplying these products in these value chains. Because if they don't have that particular certificate or standard, they're not going to be able to sell their products. Okay, that in terms of an introduction to sort of hint at that we take a somewhat different perspective at this reality, to try and live up to Karin's expectation of giving a different flavor to the discussion. The paper actually tries to pick up from what Nicola said at a certain point, that global standards can be criticized for not actually having space for local contextualization. And this is where our story, in a way, begins. We look at this and we actually argue that the present existence of a multitude of these often global multi-stakeholder type of consensus-based processes of reaching global standards, either with or without governments, again, that's not the most relevant issue at the local level, leads to a drive towards watering down, universalizing key indicators that actually make achieving local impact very difficult. So this push for universalization at the level of the boardroom, at the level of governments, at the level of UN resolutions, goes against this idea of local diversity, the need to contextualize and to find tailor-made solutions. Now, that is sort of a grand claim in a sense. We have two examples to sort of at least hopefully try and make you start thinking about whether there might be something to this claim. I will present the first example, which is on child labor, and Samer will take over then here and talk about cook stoves, and then Samer will also do the conclusion. Now, the case on child labor is chosen on purpose because it is sort of one of the iconic issues that is always high on the agenda for sustainability standards in fair trade, in ethical trade, in different kinds of environments, both corporate and government related. And I want to sort of talk very briefly about the distinction between two practices in the world of voluntary sustainability standards when looking at the issue of child labor. There is the so-called zero tolerance approach and the so-called improvement-oriented approach. Now, the zero tolerance approach was traditionally used by NGOs, human rights activists, and well, the label basically says it does not allow for any child labor to take place, for example, in a coffee farm. Now that sounds nice, and it's easy to sell from a marketing perspective when you want to sell fair trade coffee in Europe, but it doesn't really help much in terms of changing local practices. Because what does it mean? It means that the relatively poor, more marginalized farmers cannot actually get into these certification schemes. Because for them, usually child labor is a relatively normal phenomena, and it takes time and effort of local activists to actually change these practices. Now that is done in what is called an improvement-oriented approach. Paradoxically enough, the improvement-oriented approach is what is usually used by corporates. So Starbucks, Utz, and all sorts of major brand-related certification schemes used traditionally an improvement-oriented approach, which offered a way for more marginalized producers to grow into the system. So this would mean that you get 6 months, for example, to sort out these child labor issues on your farm. And you would have an argument versus a local NGO or a trade union about whether your children could actually work on the farm part-time when it is holiday season at school, or these sorts of more nuanced things are starting to get into the picture. Now the reality now is that both corporate codes of conduct and NGO codes use a mix nowadays of zero tolerance and improvement-oriented standards, and that actually child labor is now mostly, again, in these more zero tolerance domains. Okay, that was the child labor example I wanted to briefly mention, and I now hand over to Samer to talk about a different case, but it has quite some similar elements in terms of local contextualization complications. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So, if you'll allow me, I'd like to briefly introduce a case of improved cook stoves. And just as a show of hands, is anyone in the room familiar with or aware of the case of these cook stoves? They're promoted in developing countries and rural areas for a variety of reasons. Just a show of hands, is anyone familiar? So a few people. So I'll just give a brief overview. Essentially, these cook stoves, and here we have a metal example, and then some local variations of mud stoves that are made to fit people's own stoves. They've been promoted globally by development and humanitarian actors since the 1970s, first in response to the first oil crisis, out of a fear that the high liquid petroleum gas prices would force people to continue to use wood fuel as a dominant fuel. So there were fears of deforestation, mass fears of deforestation. So these cook stoves were first promoted by World Bank and other agencies and national governments. In the 1990s, they were promoted under the discourse of smoke and health, and there was a recognition of this global actors came together under the banner of Killer in the Kitchen, and the idea is that in poor households all over the world, women and girls who are cooking are exposed to smoke from inefficient combustion of fuel. That's what smoke is, the inefficient combustion of fuel, and exposed to those particles, and there were serious health concerns. In the early 2000s, cook stoves were first promoted as a protection tool to prevent women from gender-based violence in the context of Darfur, under the assumption that if you theoretically reduced the need for wood by increasing the efficiency of a stove, you could theoretically reduce the risk of exposure when people were going to collect wood. Not that there's evidence to support the idea that stoves reduce violence, which there's not. From 2010, under under the leadership of an organization called the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves, which was launched by Hillary Clinton, which is an organization under a Ted Turner-funded agency called the UN Foundation. It has nothing to do with the United Nations, but it's called the United Nations Foundation, and which was set up to increase the U.S. State Department's influence on UN agency activities. The Global Alliance has promoted the cook stoves as a climate change tool, as a carbon technology, and also has launched with the ISO and is chairing an international standards process to test and certify cook stoves as a climate technology, with the idea that national governments using the standard can help regulate and construct markets around the way 3 billion of the poorest people in the world cook. And so there's huge market implications, and also, just as a note, indoor air pollution is also being pushed by the Global Alliance and others. There's a ongoing debate in the Lancet at the moment about whether or not clean air is a human right. So there's indoor air pollution is being framed as impinging on the rights of billions of the world's poor. Now, and I'll just summarize quickly, but essentially the ISO process, which I'm also a party to as a representative of the Dutch National Standards Agency, is developing a lab-based test which controls for everything but the stove. So you have on the left a lab-based test using wood, specific pot, specific burn cycle, etc., to measure emissions. And what I've found from recent field work in Darfur, which took place last summer, as a follow-up of field work I've been doing in Darfur since 2006, is that women are using these very stoves in extremely different ways, in ways that a number of scientists are starting to raise concerns that the actual lab-based test that is being developed is almost completely irrelevant to cooking practices in the field. And the question and the debate, both in the standards process, but also increasingly outside the process, is whether or not, is the concern that cook stoves that are tested and certified in the context of this universal lab-based logic will hold any relevance. And of course the concern is if you promote tens of thousands or even millions of cook stoves that are carbon certified but aren't used in the way that are intended, that they won't actually have the climate impacts that have been prescribed or are assumed. It's kind of like the Volkswagen scandal in the sense that the technology is also being developed in ways that perform better in the test. And you see designers designing the technology, using the test to design the technology, but in actual field use, the outcomes are quite different. And this leads, and the case of child rights that Peter spoke to, leads us to raise a couple of questions, primarily about the local relevance of global standards. Again, Nicola mentioned this, but also whether or not global standards can be designed in ways that are flexible to contextual variation and to the needs of different contexts. And so we'll leave it with these questions, I think, and thanks for your time.
Thank you very much to both of you, Peter and Summer, for giving us what I would take as a reality check in the first place. Among others by the fact that you reminded the lawyers and others in this room that what lawyers may call voluntary in practice is not quite so voluntary. And also for giving us two highly practical examples of what may come up once we try to actually realize or operationalize globalized standards at the local level. We now move to slightly higher ground again, I would think, through the presentation by Rachel Adams. of the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London on how transparency was put into discourse, problematizing human rights, universality and neutrality.
Hi, thank you so much, and I just want to take a second to thank you for having me here, and thank you to the organisers for putting together a really nicely crafted conference that actually speaks to a lot of very similar kind of themes and approaches in very different ways. And I'm really glad, having come at the end of the panel, to see how my paper does fit within this panel, which was a serious worry, but it really fits nicely. So I'm really pleased about that. And I think, you know, it's broadly about the problematics of a global discourse. And another link to Hillary Clinton, which is exciting, and we'll get to in a minute. So I'm talking about, how do we come down? I'm talking about really this very big and broad concept of transparency. Sorry, do I just press it down to get to the next one? This one?
Yeah.
Is it maybe just... Or I can skip through it. Sorry. Let me, for the sake of time, just explain that this particular paper forms part of the earlier chapters of my thesis, which I graduated from last year. So it's work I've done a while ago, but it forms a sort of foundational point for a lot of the work that I've subsequently done on this idea of transparency. So, it's fine. Okay, lovely. There's Hillary Clinton. So you know, just to extend that, I used to work at the South African Human Rights Commission a number of years ago as the private sector, so another link to the relevance of this panel, the private sector compliance officer for the National Promotion of Access to Information Act. And this was where I first sort of noticed this idea of transparency. So transparency was sort of being claimed as a human right, but at the same time it was a corporate value, and it continues. So now transparency is really, really proliferated. It's a human right, but it's also talked about in terms of tax transparency, corporate transparency, transparency in political campaigns, transparency in parliament, open budgets, open data, fiscal transparency, world aid transparency. I could go on, and now my focus is more on issues around algorithmic transparency and transparency in the black box issue of artificial intelligence. But the point is that transparency is everywhere. And I know yesterday we had a bit of deliberations about defining it, but part of the defining terms, part of the issue with transparency is it's a term that's not very readily understood and defined. So it's broadly sort of used nowadays as a call for the greater liberalisation of information. But if you look at the term and the idea of transparency, it originated in the 18th century with regards to the camera, and it was the transparent lens through which the production of an image was made. So it was really a term about making visible. So then the use of transparency nowadays in terms of disclosure of information, it's metaphoric. And that sort of metaphorical use, the fact that it's not literally applicable, that states and institutions and private companies and budgets cannot literally be seen and opened up, is very much lost in the discourse that sort of come about as a result of that. So that's very much the starting point of where I've come from. The fact that it's such a big idea, but its history is forgotten, its history is obscured, it's seen as a value that's neutral and that's universal. So every time I talk about Foucault, there's this big sigh, like, oh God, not Foucault again. But here he is, and I found the coolest picture I could of him in a leather jacket to say that he really is still very relevant. And I think especially in terms of what Nicola was talking about earlier, in terms of this idea of discourse, so much of discourse theory comes from what Foucault said about discourse. I'm just going to quickly go over that again. And very briefly, his idea of discourse, it was a technique of problematization. So he talked about discourse as a historically contingent social system that produces knowledge and meaning such that they constitute practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. And this is how discourse can manifest itself materially. Language matters, but it matters because it can manifest materially in the world around us. It can shape social and global relations. So discourse is then a way of organising knowledge that structures the constitution of social and progressively global relations through the collective understanding of this discursive logic and the acceptance of discourse as a social fact. So discourses are produced by particular effects of power within a social order, and this power prescribes particular rules and categories which define the criteria of legitimating knowledge and truth within this discursive order. But these rules and categories for deciding what's true and what's not, they're considered a priori, so they're considered as coming before the discourse. And this is the way in which discourse masks its own construction and poses as neutral or as universal. So my sort of aim here is really by problematizing the statements of transparency, and some of these statements I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about. By problematizing these statements of transparency, I aim to open up questions about the supposedly natural and fixed meanings of the concept and critique the techniques of legitimization and delegitimization that this particular discourse performs. The second picture is of Gramsci, because I talk about this discourse of transparency being hegemonic. I'm not going to get into the difference between Gramsci and Foucault, because putting those two together is a little bit of a faux pas, because Gramsci is a Marxist and Foucault really rejects Marxism. But let's ignore that entirely, because it works for the purposes of what I'm trying to do here. So what I want to highlight in terms of Gramsci's idea of hegemony is the process through which hegemony takes place. So for Foucault, this would be the normalization of discourse, but for Gramsci, he talks about the spontaneous consent, which is the sort of tacit agreement through which people absorb the particular position that's being forced on by the dominant group. So I've got a little quote here from his prison's notebooks, where he talks about this idea of tacit agreement or spontaneous consent as being given by the great masses of the population to the general direction imposed on social life by the dominant fundamental group. This consent is historically caused by the prestige which the dominant group enjoys because of its position and function in the world of production. So capitalism and the links between capitalism and transparency is something that I've done a lot of work on, but I'm not going to go into today. I'm now going to move to look quite closely at what these statements are, what's being said about transparency. And I'm turning to the work of the Open Government Partnership that I had a picture up on the earlier slide. Not because I'm focusing only on governments in the state, but because the Open Government Partnership really sort of articulates in a nice, very problematic, but nice for my work, kind of way that this global discourse and what it's trying to do. So I've got, this is the Open Government Partnership Declaration. So when states want to join this lovely elitist community of transparency go-getters, they have to sign on to this declaration. And when I last researched it, I think there were about 90 countries that were part of the OGP. So it's really quite a lot, and the number is growing. So just to quickly go through this, we acknowledge that people all around the world are demanding more openness in government. They are calling for greater civic participation in public affairs and seeking ways to make their governments more transparent, and so on. We recognise that countries are at different stages in their efforts to promote openness in government, and we accept responsibility for seizing the moment to strengthen the commitments to promote transparency. So I want to go back to a point that Nicola made earlier about the importance of language, and just look at what the language in the grammar is doing here in terms of concealing various things. So first of all, it's saying very specifically that people all around the world are are demanding more openness in government, and they are calling for greater civic participation. So at once, this geographically neutralises the transparency discourse, something that's happening everywhere. This is not a Western concept that's been promoted in the Global South, for instance. This is something that everyone, everywhere, is a part of and is asking for. But it also, if we're looking at this Gramscian idea of the dominant group, it masks the position of the dominant group within its own grammatical insistence that transparency is being demanded by the people. Later, we accept responsibility for seizing the moment. We haven't created this moment, but we will do the right thing and seize this moment and garner further support for it. But it's not a moment that we've created. Very important here. And then the other thing that I found very interesting is this statement: we recognise that the countries are at different stages in their efforts to promote openness in government. So here, what it's saying is that transparency is a singular inevitability that we all want and we all should be working for in countries at various different stages of doing this. So in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and leaving no one behind, transparency is doing the same thing. The discourse of transparency, neither the governments nor the people are left out of the purchase of this discourse. Yet this sort of insistence on inclusivity is problematic. So what it does is sort of creates a general suspicion or problematizes those people, or those institutions or governments that do not conform to this discourse. Immediately there's something that falls outside of the logic of this discourse, so they're considered possibly even immoral, they've got something to hide, there's something wrong, and they are a target for further transparency propaganda, if we might want to call it that. So this is another little, this is the OGP's lovely branding. Make things open, it makes things better. And this is the last little part of the Open Government Declaration. We embrace principles of transparency and open government with a view toward achieving greater prosperity, well-being and human dignity in our own countries and in an increasingly interconnected world. Now, these are huge claims. Transparency equals dignity. Massive claim. So what this is doing is creating a kind of ethics of transparency. Transparency is not just about the disclosure of information. Transparency is the ethical way to live, to behave, to be governed in today's world society. But also this idea of transparency as kind of a transformative agent is also problematic, as it therefore sort of leaves people that don't fall into this category or don't choose to be part of this category as considered something that might be on the borders of unethical. I don't know if anyone knows what this picture is of, but it goes back to what I identified as the first use of the word and the idea of transparency as a political metaphor when Lord Brandeis said that sunlight is the best disinfectant in 1913. That was in relation to the financial sector. It was not in relation to government, although that idea of sunshine was later used for all the sunshine policies in the US and in North Korea, I think it is. But this is the design for the League of Nations building in 19-something by Hans Mayer. It was not the successful design, but what he sort of wrote up in his little write-up to the design was that no pillared reception rooms for weary monarchs, but hygienic workrooms for the busy representatives of their nations. No back rooms for backstairs diplomacy, but open glass rooms for public negotiations of honest men. And this is where we get another big claim of the transparency discourse, this idea that transparency engenders trust, and transparency is about honesty. So again, we're seeing this idea of transparency as an ethics. I go into a lot more detail about this in another piece, but this idea that transparency engenders trust is really quite depoliticizing. So on the one hand, not yet time for Hillary. So on the one hand, this statement that transparency engenders trust, it functions as a mechanism of self-legitimization for whatever institution is claiming to be transparent and therefore trustworthy. So for an institution to make a discursive claim of being trustworthy on account of being transparent, they concurrently foreclose any critiques of not being trustworthy. But secondly, it's depoliticizing because it means that transparency represents itself as a sort of unquestionable value and one that sits above or transcends politics. So transparency engenders honesty and trust, but at once sterilises political intention. So this is a hygienic workroom. It's not political. We've gone beyond that. It's a neutral value. So these are just some of the transparency statements that I've spoken about. But what does it do? Well, these kind of statements work together to mythologise, to idealise transparency. And Roland Barthes is the big leading figure who talks about the work of mythologisation. And he says that this work of mythologisation is the perfecting of speech, such that it appears both innocent and natural, even eternal, so without any history. It's not historically contingent. It's always been there. So thus the objective of myth, in this case transparency, becomes naturalised, fundamental and intrinsic. So when Hillary Clinton, this is her at the Benghazi trials in 2016, and she said, and I'm not sure she was doing this when she said it, she said, "I believe in transparency." And when she was making this really big sort of claim and idea, which is really reflected in such subsequent discourse all around the world, she's taking transparency and making it this perfect truth value, something that's completely, it's something to be believed in. And I've got another quote from somebody called John Roberts, who says that we seem to believe in transparency, and with every failure of government, but even failures of transparency, we are prone to invest in yet further transparency as the assumed remedy for all failures. And I think this is something that's very true in global discourse, is that there's this default position to say, well, something's wrong, let's just say we need to have more transparency, there needs to be more transparency. And it's become a sort of stock answer to a lot of the issues. It has become something to believe in, something that just keeps coming up again and again without question. So what are the effects of a hegemonic discourse? Now, I'm just looking at two of the effects here. One is that it seeks to expand itself and normalise itself through society. And we can see this in what I talk about as the proselytisation of transparency in other parts of the world. This is an example of the proselytisation of transparency in aid agreements. So this is a discussion that took place in the Portfolio Committee in Parliament in the UK a few years ago with Alan Duncan, who was the then Minister of State of the Department of International Development. And I don't think I have time to go through the whole thing, but what I want to draw your attention to is that he talks about this sort of Gramscian idea of soliciting consent, implicit consent for transparency. It's not being forced. And he says, can we impose or dictate it in all cases? Of course not. Can we wheedle it out of some institutions and make progress? Yes, and wherever we can, we do. And later on, he says, well, what we can do is we can say we'll give you funding, but only we'll give you aid if you commit to our principles of transparency. So he says, we'll give you some core funding in principle, but we'll hold it back until you improve yourselves. So here we get this idea of normalisation, be it against a transparency measure or another cost or efficiency measure. So the other thing that the UK sort of seems to be doing here is claiming transparency. They're doing this implicitly, but claiming transparency as its own value that it's now impressing on other parts of the world. The other thing that the discourse of transparency does, or another effect of a discourse, is that it forecloses or delegitimises other realities. So in the case of transparency, this will be other forms of governance, but it will be other forms of knowing or other forms of information. And this was an idea, and this is my last point, that was raised somewhat in a case in South Africa, which Judge Cameron then gave a nice little talk about what was meant with this idea of records. So in the South African Access to Information Law, it provides access to records. So it moves from this right in the Constitution, it's a right of access to information, but in the Act, it suddenly becomes a right of access to records. So there's semantic shifts, and Judge Cameron talks a little bit about the consequences of this and talks about the fact that there may be oral information that's therefore not recorded and therefore falls out of the scope, and this can be problematic. This is a particular kind of failing of the South African Act, because the Model Access to Information Law and many other access to information laws have imposed a duty for record keeping. So this might be something that's overcome in that situation. But the thing that this raises is that this discourse of transparency raises particular other understandings of what information, what knowledge is. So one of the big things that I'm doing work on now is this privileging, this epistemological privileging of ideas of data. Data is fact, data is truth, and everything in society, all our policies and governance come from evidence-informed data. So that's another issue here. But another point that has been raised about this sort of issue of the delegitimization of other forms of information have been raised by Colin Darch and Underwood in a piece where they've actually critiqued this Access to Information Act in South Africa. And they have got a really nice quote that I'm going to read here. And they say, here is the crux of the matter. The information-rich, information-poor debate has been characterised largely in terms of access to documents, be they in electronic, print on paper, or other recorded forms. What has been ignored in the information culture to be found in any community, which comprises of a mixture of oral and recorded knowledge and perceptions, we should remember that for a substantial time, the only reason for recording something was because it was considered not worth memorising. Now, I think this is a real sort of shake-up to the Western idea of, we need to write everything down and document it. It's really against this sort of legal epistemology. So I thought I would end with that. But the point is that it shows that the demarcation of the boundaries of the signification of information and knowledge are being controlled by particular global discourses that therefore eradicate other ideas or other meanings of what these things can be. So just to conclude, this is a man called Lawrence Lessig, who many of you may have heard of, but who has written on transparency, and I'm sure he wasn't pulling this particular face when he said this quote, but it seemed apt. And I want to conclude with this because, you know, what I've sought to do here is to explain how transparency, at least partially, is being put into discourse and to critique the effects of that, and to describe discourse as a prescriptive set of ideas which structure the way in which we see and think about the world. And I've sought to show that within modern society, the idea of transparency has become a dominant centre from which other forms of knowledge and governance and information deviate. Transparency is a powerful sign. It's loaded with particular powerful values which hold the ability to create and shape other phenomena to which they're associated. And as a discourse, transparency rests on a number of preconceived categories of reason in order to outwardly project itself as universal, inclusive, natural, a priori. And some of these preconceived categories of reason would be democracy and human rights. But in particular, these claims, what they do is they forbid transparency from being critiqued. As Lawrence Lessig asserts, how could anyone be against transparency? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your lively presentation, which surely helps us to see, again, both the potential and the pros and cons of transparency approaches. Ellen Heij has the interesting task of commenting on this full set of presentations now in about 10 minutes. You have the floor.
Yes, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to, or I don't know if I could thank you for asking me to comment on these papers, but I do thank the presenters and the organizers for making me think. And I'm glad I didn't come to dinner last night because I was thinking till quite late to try and put this together. I am most interested in all of your papers on their own. I'm also interested in them together, and I did try to, and I was even working on that as you were speaking, but tried to sort of summarize the themes in your papers, but I'm not going to do that given the time. So I'm going to share with you the question that I asked myself, well, basically last night. And that question was, how do you tie this together in any one way, which, you know, I think is something that us as academics owe to our audience, both the other academics but also the stakeholders out there who we talk about, write about. Now, I want to emphasize that when I tell you what I came up with, which is of course related to my own ongoing research because that's what's in the top of my mind, my aim is not for you to pursue other aims in your research. It is also not to change your methodology, because I think that is what gives the richness here, that there are these various aims in what you want to pursue with your research, and you also use different methodologies. And one thing I noticed when I read whatever I was sent and that you'd sent in, was that to me, all these, in your papers, there is an overarching theme, and it's about new regimes, new value systems, old value systems meeting each other. And obviously not meeting each other harmoniously. Whether it's, national courts trying to implement what one might call a human rights approach, or not a human rights approach, I guess one could differ, but trying to resonate with the claims that are brought by people who've suffered due to the actions of corporations in the global south, and trying to accommodate that within, let's say, the regimes about investment law, about law that applies to corporations. Whether it's human rights and the SDGs, or the SDGs and human rights. So I think, or whether it's certain ways of knowing that then set aside other ways of knowing, or whether it's local and global rules. And so when thinking about this, of course, what came to my mind was regime interaction. Now, not regime interaction in the traditional sense, which tends to look at what happens in courts only when regimes clash. But I think Jeff Dunhove in, 2012, he made a proposal that we should look at regime interaction in different ways. Now, Jeff only addresses the global level of regime interaction. He doesn't look at national courts. But I think he makes the point that, yes, of course, regime interaction takes place before courts, but it also takes place in a regulatory and administrative setting, in operational interactions, which speaks to the paper by, Peter and Sommer, and also conceptual interactions. And I think if we take Jeff Dunhove's ideas about regime interaction and expand those to include interactions before national courts, to include these operational interactions, which he also speaks to, I think that might be a way of linking these various very rich stories to each other, in that each of you will be able to show where the contestation arises when these different value systems, legal systems, whatever, meet. And why do I think regime interaction, as expressed by Jeff Dunhove, is a very valuable way of looking at what happens in these different situations, is because it offers us a way of illustrating who and what matters in a different regime and how it matters. It allows, I think, us to uncover that. And I think that is, in fact, what many of you are trying to do, but there doesn't, or which, no, not trying to do, sorry, are doing. But I think for our readers, it would be interesting if there was somewhat of a common theme, which then allows the reader, him or herself, to integrate or to link the stories in a more meaningful way. I think I managed 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for a very useful reflection. With an eye on the clock, I'm going to skip what I announced earlier, that is that we immediately go back to the panel now. I think Alan's point is very clear, and I think we can all manage to hold our response until we have added a couple of interventions from the audience. After all, we only have 15 to 20 minutes left. So can I see who is interested in making a comment or asking a question right now? Yeah, the three of you. Then we take those three and then we go back to the panel for a response to both Alan's point and these three added ones.
Thank you. I'm Jackie Dugard. Thank you for really very interesting papers. I wanted to make a very short comment on, sorry.
No, go ahead,
Okay.
go ahead, sorry.
A very short comment on a couple of them. The first to Lisbeth, I think that tactically and strategically, I would say that as human rights lawyers and activists, you always frame your case in whatever way is going to make sense. And I think that it was very important that the Alien Torts Act has been used, and for a while it was actually very useful. My understanding from Americans, etc., is that there's a pushback now and a real politicization of the judiciary around the Aliens Tort Act, and it has to do a lot to do with Israel. And that there is a particular issue there in this moment. Possibly in the future it can be used as a ground again for human rights. But I think it is important that you know, these frames, it doesn't mean we can't use it again. We should use whatever we can, whenever we can use it. And I think it's important to also establish the limits in each terrain at each time. On the issue of the challenge of global embedding, local embedding of global standardization of sustainability, there's an interesting, also obvious debate in human rights in socioeconomic rights regarding minimum core content obligations. But I think that there you find that actually the local has been able to very clearly set its own particular context within that core. And I would imagine that might still be possible within sustainability. Maybe you can say something more about that, about the global there. Rachel, my God, I don't know where to start on how interesting that was. It really, really was. My one thought was that the make things open, it makes things better tagline could perhaps be used by the Open Relationships Are Us Society as a great tagline. Make things open, it makes things better. And then that's a bit of a joke, but then I did wonder, it did make me wonder, well, does it? And I have to say, maybe my tacit consented hegemonic incorporation of the discourse made me think that surely it is always better to be open. But maybe it isn't. French women would say perhaps you've got to keep some secrets. So I don't know. And it would be interesting to hear from you if you have ideas about when it is not better to be open. I understand the critique that, for example, it's a critique of Transparency International that I was speaking to Jeff about the other day, that yes, it's all about transparency. Don't worry about, you know, the WTO trade regulations. Don't worry about, you know, global systems and structures. It's all about transparency. I understand that, but is there any examples you have of where transparency isn't a good thing? Yeah, thank you, sorry.
Thank you very much. My name is Federica Violi, Erasmus School of Law. Thank you for the speakers. It was really interesting. And I really liked the whole language discourse, or the discourse framing. I think it's very important to be aware that how we frame things changes also our judgments and our evaluation. So that was really a transversal thing throughout the speeches. That was very interesting. Starting from that, I have a question for both Lisbeth Enneking and Nicola Jägers. The due diligence discourse, again, it's becoming more and more relevant, and I see that from an international law perspective. But recently, the International Law Association is coming up with a report on due diligence, and there have been raised some concerns on how the due diligence concept is used in corporations. In the Ruggies principles, there seems to be some inconsistency. Sometimes this is used in the more public international law notion of it, sometimes in the more corporate notion of it. If I think of the corporation world, due diligence is just a process that you do when you start operations, and it's like a kind of a checklist. So my question would be, how do you define due diligence in the context of business and human rights for corporations, of course? What is the content of the obligation or the duty, and what would qualify a violation of due diligence obligations? I don't know whether in tort law this is an easy task or not, but I've been struggling myself to understand what it means, basically. What is the juridical content of it? Thank you.
I think I want to follow up in a way on Ellen's point of making connections, and my take on this would be a point that Nicola made and said that she wouldn't address. I'm always intrigued by those. Yeah. Oh, well, probably you do. But I was thinking of actually the troubling mix of goals and rights talk. And I think this is actually cutting across all of your papers. My comment or my question would actually be, for instance, to Peter and Summer, to what extent does rights talk pop into these very goal-oriented ideas like cook stoves? And Summer, you hinted on this when some of these framings were in terms of a right to health, right? And what does that do to them? So but also for instance, I was thinking of back to Lisbeth's juxtaposition of the private law liability framing and rights, where you could also think of the different goals that enter into holding someone accountable. I'm not sure how to exactly do that now, but I think you could do that very well. And I think also with the transparency discourse, you could think of this as goal-oriented. Well, I was thinking in the back of my mind, but what if we frame it differently? What if you talk about a right to access to information, which is a different way of talking about transparency, but not in such universalizing. It's a good for all in all contexts, but much more specific. And then linking back to Lisbeth's point of what was one of the benefits of these cases, that it was possible to draw out this information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jeff, can we have that mic, please? Yes. Because this one is not very good. And I propose that we just go down the table and ask each panelist now to respond, both to Ellen's general point and to some of the follow-ups and extensions, but also to the other issues that were raised.
Sure. Where to start? In 1 minute? Oh gosh, that's impossible. So I'm not going to do it any justice. What does human rights due diligence mean? And I'm going to try to link it up to your very right remarks about what seems to somehow connect us, and that's how regimes interact. And I think human rights due diligence is such a perfect example of why language matters, because UN guiding principles are very easily claimed as being such a success. And what John Ruggie did, he used language in a very crafty manner by marrying these two concepts from the corporate world and from human rights law, where they mean very different things. In corporate, from the corporate perspective, it's about risk analysis, risks to the corporation, whereas from international human rights law, it's about a duty of care towards others. And he sort of very easily stepping over all the complexities that these two are really actually very different concepts, married them, seemingly making everyone happy and making everybody accept these UN guiding principles, on the superficial level at least. So it's very easily claimed that it's a success, and that's what triggered me to look into exactly when two regimes, in this case the Sustainable Development Goals and business and human rights, when they merge, or do they merge, and what happens? And I'm a lot less ambitious than what Ellen pointed out, that would bring to the surface who and what matters and why, because that's all very relevant. But I think we have to start at looking whether there is actually any truth to this claim that it's successful. Is there any uptake of these ideas into another regime? And then the next question is, if not, why not? And if so, who is taking it up and why? But they're all questions for further research, I would say.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the comments as well. And I don't know where to start, but I think one of the, just also going a little bit into one of the things that struck me about the way you contrasted sustainable development and human rights, or the way it is being contrasted, is that I think the discourse on sustainable development is very appealing to companies, much more than human rights discourse, because human rights discourse is always, it's always by definition about the other. And I think sustainable development, in a large sense, can also be about yourself. And I think I agree completely with what you say, also in relation to the due diligence, the way in which John Ruggie uses, or the way he drafted basically UN guiding principles. Why they are so successful is because everyone can interpret them in their own way. And especially, and I think that even more so with the sustainable development goals, because if you look at in a corporate context, sustainable development may also just mean the longer term existence of the company itself. And this is actually also a way in which this is being used. So for companies, this sort of concept of sustainable development, yay, you know, because that's good for us. And I think there is an important difference there between talking about sustainable development and talking about human rights. And I do think that in that sense, I do think what the question that you asked, that the sustainable development goals are undermining the UNGPs, because they're making it possible again to just look at yourself and not look at the other. Whereas I think that was what the UNGPs were trying to achieve, to make companies look at the interests of third parties. And so this is also, at least to the due diligence, how do you define it? We were saying we could write a PhD and probably more on that if we could write it. I think the due diligence concept is so sweet because it's not defined. And also I think in tort law, what I think is interesting about tort law and about these cases is that it hasn't really happened yet, but that in a sense, on a case-by-case basis, so also in a very pragmatic way, on a case-by-case basis, you're asking questions about basically what are we expecting in these circumstances of this company, how much care should they take towards the interests of others, and maybe it may not always be framed as a due diligence question or as a due diligence issue. It may become like that in future cases, perhaps. That would be interesting, but it is essentially we are talking about the same thing. As with respect to about the Alien Tort Statute, I agree with that. We should use whatever we can. We should recognize that sort of, if we're in camps, the other side, so basically, for instance, corporate actors are also using whatever they can. This is also the point I was making about how they embrace the sustainable development goals, because that suits their purpose. What I regret, in a sense, is that I do think that sometimes discourses become very closed in on themselves, and I do think that happened with the whole discourse, if you look at it from a human rights perspective on the Alien Tort Statute, and a little bit also the business human rights discourse. And this is what for me, coming from a different perspective, a private law perspective, I find it very helpful to sort of look at it from a broader perspective, because then you find that there may be solutions in other fields that you haven't thought about because you were just talking to one another and to no one else anymore. That's sort of the bigger picture, and the not mixing of goals language and rights language. I think that's a very interesting point, which almost goes back to some very fundamental sort of ideas about sorry, I'm not going to finish this because it's going to become too complicated for me. I haven't slept that much this last night because of preparing my presentation. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, thank you so much for the response and for the questions. Just briefly, in terms of this idea of regime interaction and where contestations arise, I think part of the problem with this idea of transparency is it's turning up in all regimes. It's in the sustainability goals, it's somewhere in there. It's talked about in transparency, in human rights discourse, it's talked about within various sort of corporate discourses. And therefore, if you're talking about the sustainability goals and the use of human rights undermining one another, then what does it do to human rights if transparency appears to be a value of both human rights and corporatism. So I think, you know, part of the problem with transparency is it's coming up everywhere. And then, Jackie, in terms of some of your questions, is it better to be open? Well, no. I mean, there's somebody called Claire Birchall who's written an article called Secrets of the Left and talked about the need to embrace secrets within left-wing politics, and it's a really interesting piece if you're interested. But a practical example would be the vote of no confidence in Parliament in South Africa, and that was done secretly, and it was a sort of necessary secretism. But also, you know, just thinking very broadly about this discourse of openness and open societies and open universities and open access, who is this world being opening up for? There's many people who have been turned down at borders, and life is closing. And the reality of closures is much more sort of restrictive than this sort of world of possibilities that openness is aspiring towards. So I think it's really important to sort of think about who is this open society being opened up for. And then I could go on and on and on, but I think the other sort of issue is that this discourse of transparency is creating sort of transparent subjects. So it's creating transparency through things like surveillance, even through an ethics which requires us to be transparent in behaviour. And this is normalising, this is problematizing. It's problematizing for people who are the wrong colour or the wrong religion and who are being surveilled unnecessarily because of things that shouldn't be. So I think, yes, there's a huge problem with openness, and it shouldn't be adopted writ large, and there should be many more questions about whether this is something we want and in what context.
Thanks. Well, thanks for the really insightful summary and also questions. And there's a few points that I made, and hopefully I can address them in a quick and concise way. One, this notion of minimum core obligation, it really provoked, in my mind, a debate that's happening within the standards process around the lab-based test versus pressure from members for a field-based test and to get more field-based thinking and contextual testing, which, in a sense of their critique, the field-based approach is still being subsumed within this technocentric logic, and so it's still being the contextual elements are still being brought into the lab, and in a way, the pressure to universalization is really hindering, I think, this notion of taking context relevant. More importantly, is the standard is just a guide, and national standards bodies across the world will then ratify and implement, and the idea is that will localize. But then the question is, for most of the states in which this standard is relevant, and mostly in developing or low-income contexts or developing country contexts, whether or not those standards agencies have the resources or technical the technical resources or the human resources to actually do the work of localization. And what tends to happen is, with the ratification, there might be an incentive by the Global Alliance or some other organization to help build a lab, and with that resources come consultancies and all these other, the professions, the global professions will descend and will promote a very universal approach. It also, what is provoked is really, and it was just touched on, it is a consensus process. International standards processes are long and arduous, and they are a consensus process, but the key people in this case, the users, are really not at the table, and the cooks, nor are they really aware of the process. And many of the people who are involved in the process are also not aware of how people cook. They haven't done this, the extensive type of field work that is required to understand how people cook and use the technology. The goal rights framing, this is going to be a bit of a general statement. It's probably less complicated. There is this goal in rights, but what I see in and around the advocacy work around cook stoves is that the rights are being used to advance the goals, and the goals aren't being used necessarily to advance the rights. And so the rights become important, the right to clean air, the right to protection from violence, etc., when they're being used to advance. So what happens is there's in a sense, this notion in the literature I work in called the garbage can model, whereby there's solutions that are looking for problems. So the cook stove is a solution, and it tends to find every decade the problem that it's meant. And one of those, the problem could be rights, and that's what I think is really happening in some of these technocentric interventions. In terms of the local, and the point about local agency is really important, and I see that in how local entrepreneurs have manipulated these technologies, and local artisans, maybe entrepreneurship is too strong a word, but local artisans that have manipulated these technologies in ways that are being taken up by locals, and sometimes it works in a poor way. For example, I know in townships with kerosene stoves in South Africa, the safety stops are often manipulated, and they're broken so that people can continue to cook or cook at higher power, and that leads to a lot of fires and thousands of burns in townships annually. So that can work both ways. But what's also happening is a lot of the abuses get pushed out of the sunlight and into the shadows. So there has been a lot of work on soccer ball and the soccer ball industry in Pakistan, where local factory owners were working on one hand in one arena to demonstrate an adherence to the standards for the legitimacy and the social, the license to operate, essentially, even though they're voluntary standards. But on the other hand, child laborers were kind of being pushed into the margins, and also women were being brought into the stitching in ways that actually created more layers of marginalization, but the international community was satisfied in that case. So there's these power dynamics meant to avoid the key goals, I think, of the standards. And so thanks for that.
Yeah? Okay, no, I was looking at the time, but okay. Yeah, I think I wanted to add two other examples in relation to the questions. One is also in this rights talk popping up in the goal setting context. Does that make our lives more difficult in working at the local level? And the answer is yes. And I was reminded of an example that I've been involved in recently, which is about the way in which the Dutch sort of export their polder model, or the Dutch diamond, which is about this sort of transparent, trust-based collaboration in multi-stakeholder settings. Yeah, so you have the NGOs, the trade unions, local corporates, as well as local governments or national governments involved, and they all magically work together transparently, build trust, and this is how they address local challenges like child rights. Now, if you start to try and export such a model to, let's say, the tea sector in India is one of the examples that we've been working on. Then if you know anything about India or anything about the tea sector, you would soon see that this is sort of setting you up for a very difficult challenge. More generally, what happens in these kinds of interventions that are using the language of the Sustainable Development Goals in order to intervene, and using the human rights discourses, is that they don't start from what is locally possible. Let's say work with 2 or 3 critical NGOs that are willing to maybe work together with a trade union that's not purely politicized, etc. No, they start from the ideal picture as it doesn't really exist in the Netherlands, but as it is sort of framed and being exported. And then they start by saying, no, that critical NGO, that's not really what we need. We need another kind of NGO. So we will set up NGOs locally. So you're setting yourself up for something that follows this normative idea of that you can create something that is what you really want to have in place, instead of starting from what is actually there. So this is the sort of local, global tension. The other thing, as what Jackie started about these sort of local national influences on global processes. And there I was thinking of a national player that we haven't talked about in this session somehow, China. If you think about how the global standards system has evolved, like the ISO, the International Standards Office, and many others, it's fundamentally a UK, US sort of tandem setting of how the first and second generation of standards have been developed. We now see that China is very active, especially under the radar, in all kinds of committees all around the world in terms of new standardization processes. So the next generation of standards, whether it's for cooking stoves or for kids' rights in clothing industry, will be more and more influenced, directly and indirectly, by Chinese companies, Chinese state representatives, Chinese state employees that have to pretend that they are NGOs, because NGOs are also in these negotiations. Yeah? So there's a very strong new China factor in changing a process that has the claim of being depoliticized and being transparent, but was actually very much a Western framing of how these processes would unfold and what the desired outcomes would be. And this is changing, and China is not the only one. India is active, Brazil, South Africa, various other emerging economies are increasingly active in shaping the rules in the global arena, not so much on the government side, but more on the private side. And we're not paying sufficient attention to that, I think. So maybe I should close with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel for a very, very rich palette of ideas. I'm sorry that we end on such a gloomy note. But that's that's how it is. Another reality is that there is always insufficient time in conferences to discuss everything that needs to be discussed or that we would like to be discussed. It's the same in this session again. Fortunately, it's time for lunch now, and there's a 50-minute lunch break, and you can continue conversations over lunch. Lunch is right outside, where we also started this morning with coffee. Thank you, and see you back after lunch.
There are many. Yeah. No, because I really think that is...